Thank you for the introduction, Ricardo. As I mentioned, my research right now is mostly focused on micromobility transportation in Munich. So I don't really have anything very closely related to freight, but I do have some interesting findings from what I've seen in the e-scooter data since the start of lockdown in Munich. Let's see. Does not want to go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so most of the research that I'm going to be talking about is from a project called MOBY, which is an EIT, or European Institute of Innovation and Technology project. This is a collaboration between the city of Munich, Copenhagen, and Tel Aviv, as well as some other institutions throughout Europe. And the goal of this project is, it's not explicitly related to COVID-19. This has just sort of been something that we've recently taken interest in while doing the project. The main goal of the project is to sort of investigate these new e-micromobility systems, or the shared scooter systems in cities, and come up with a guide of sorts to help municipalities integrate them into existing transportation systems. And since I'm at the Technical University of Munich, most of my work is focused on Munich. Just a quick overview of the e-scooter situation in Munich before I get to the 19 information. So there are 5 to 6 e-scooter providers in Munich. They kind of come and go. Some are seasonal as well. They're all private companies, but one has sort of a partnership with the transit agency. The city has some regulations about what they can and can't do, but it's completely voluntary, and there's no real, I guess there's no real incentive to actually follow the rules, but it seems like for the most part they do. There's no limit to the total number of scooters that are allowed in the city, but each provider has a limit on how many they can have in certain areas. So for example, 100 scooters in the city center, and then an additional 1,000 between the city center and sort of the middle ring road around the city. And the e-scooters are allowed to use cycling infrastructure, but not sidewalks, and physically limited to 20 kilometers per hour by law in Germany. And during the COVID-19 situation, some providers stopped providing services and removed their scooters, so Voi, but I think they came back recently, and then others, such as Tier, increased their supply and been present the whole time. So I only just started collecting this data pretty much the week before lockdown really started in Germany. Wasn't really foreseeing how foreseeing lockdown coming, so it was just sort of a coincidence. I happen to have some data from before this started, but the results of just looking at this have been quite interesting. So what you see on this slide is a graph for the e-scooter trips in Munich from one of the providers. There's sort of this typical peak travel time pattern that's typical for other modes as well, such as public transport and car transport. So morning peak and then an evening peak that's a bit higher, and there's trough between them as activity dies down. This is from Monday, March 9th, 2020, which was, I think at the end of this week, was pretty much when lockdown started. And also the next week, I think, is when government offices started closing. So the total 1,233 trips, and the average duration of the trip was 6.4 minutes. Yeah. But then a few weeks later, well into the lockdown, everything was pretty different. This is Tuesday, April 14th, about a month into lockdown. Same provider, also a weekday. The number of trips decreased by about 40%, probably because no one was really going anywhere anymore. A lot of things were closed, but the average duration of trips increased to 8.7 minutes. And as you can see, looking at the graph, there's no longer a clear morning and evening peak. There's just sort of a steady increase throughout the day. and then it peaks around 4 p.m. instead of around 6 p.m. before going down again. However, this isn't necessarily still the case. I'm always collecting data, and before today's presentation, I processed some of yesterday's data to see what things look like now towards the end of lockdown. And so yesterday, June 16th, there's a significant increase in the number of trips from before. The average duration is now 9.9 minutes. Trips have gotten even longer. And there's a slight morning peak. It's nowhere near as high as it was before. And the evening peak is much higher than the pre-lockdown in the pre-lockdown time. So these findings are quite interesting. Don't know for sure, but it does sort of suggest that people may be replacing public transport trips instead of using this as a mode to go between, to sort of address first and last mile issues. When I've looked at some of the data on maps, you can see a lot of the origin and destination points are immediately next to public transport entrances. But now that these are getting longer, people may be just replacing their commute on transit if they don't want to ride the subway or the commuter trains. But once again, since this research isn't necessarily the main focus of the project, don't have more detailed results at this time, but in the future, sort of cross-reference this information with how this is compared to other modes during the lockdown time. And looking at the origin and destination points in more detail could reveal if fewer trips are starting or ending near transit stations. And the significant increase in the overall trips just between those, between yesterday and the day or the week before lockdown could mean that people may have embraced these e-scooters a bit more than they have before, and it might have a more permanent place in Munich's transportation landscape. And that's it on e-scooters and COVID-19 in Munich.